You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. All right, really excited to have you on, Megan. Normally, you're the one asking the questions,
Yes.
with Bart Ehrman. Now you're going to be the one in the hot seat. So, really excited about this. So, I understand that you're into assyriology. Tell me about how you got interested into that.
Sure. So I went to college to study ancient history. My undergraduate degree is just very broadly ancient history. We did classics and archaeology and Egyptology and Assyriology. And at that point, I wanted to be a classicist. I wanted to go off and do a master's degree and a PhD and then teach about the classics and write books about the classics and just have this amazing life as a researcher. And my undergraduate dissertation advisor was the resident Assyriologist, fantastic man called Dr. Alistair Livingstone.
Hmm.
And we were having tea one day in his office, as you do. And he was asking me what I was planning on doing after I graduated. And I said, well, I want to be a classicist. And he said, Megan, you could do that. And you would do a fantastic job. But have you considered Assyriology? We have all of this stuff that needs working through, all of these tablets being pulled out of the ground. And the thing with classics is everything's been discovered. They're not going to find a new edition of the Aeneid or the Odyssey. They're not going to find a new mythological text for you to work through. But with Assyriology, we have all this stuff that no one has read yet and no one has spent time going through. And frankly, I was hooked. So that was kind of the starting point for me. I'd taken Assyriology classes with him as an undergraduate anyway, but I did my master's degree with him and then ended up applying to Johns Hopkins to do a PhD.
Wow. So a lot of it hasn't been translated or investigated yet. So I presume that
And
you're actually going and handling cuneiform tablets and reading them and translating them. Is that right?
unfortunately not. I
Oh.
had to leave the PhD program before I graduated. I left there with another master's degree. And my life kind of took a slightly different turn. So instead of original research, most of what I do is kind of disseminating other people's research into a
Mhm.
public sphere, because Assyriologists and academics more broadly are excellent at talking to other people within their field. When
Right.
it comes to communicating with people who didn't get several degrees in this very, very niche area, it's a little bit more tricky. So I have a YouTube channel where I interview people about their own research and try and help get that information out there in a more digestible format than conference papers.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. Now, tell me, does Assyriology help us understand maybe the biblical context a little bit better? And if so, how?
Absolutely. So Assyriology is the study of the languages, culture, history of Mesopotamia, which is
Mhm.
very, very loosely the region that we now call Iraq. And the historical time frame that you can kind of specialize in runs from the mid fourth millennium through till very early CE times. That's when it's what is known as cuneiform culture. Is when people were writing using this wedge-shaped cuneiform script. So within that time period, it's obviously a huge, huge chronological period. It's a very large geographical period, which gives you a lot of scope for specialization. But it also means that a lot of the cultures that you will be looking at have come into contact with cultures like the Egyptians, the Israelites,
Mhm.
and you can kind of see the interplay between all of those different cultures, depending on the time period you're working with. And it's very, very useful for biblical studies because throughout a lot of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the bad guys are the Neo-Assyrians. So Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, he's Neo-Babylonian, but we're going to fudge terms a little bit. So it's much later in Mesopotamian history, but there's a lot of kind of interplay in terms of what's going on in the historical period. A lot of the things recorded in the Hebrew Bible are not necessarily entirely factually correct, but you can trace them back and look at what was going on thanks to Neo-Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian archives and records, you can see what was going on at that time and then understand what the writers of the Hebrew Bible are reacting to and reacting against what was going on in that time period. And as well as that, the Hebrew Bible was written against a very, very broad literary tradition. Mesopotamian writing had been going on for generations by the time the Old Testament was written. And a lot of what was kind of in the literary atmosphere had been there for a very long time and kind of constitutes like a cultural mindset, maybe a literary mindset that the writers of the Old Testament would have been very familiar with and very aware of. So you see a lot of interplay with things like Mesopotamian mythology. Some of the legal traditions are being reacted to and played with by the writers of the Old Testament.
Well, I want to get into specifically the creation stories, but before that, you mentioned there's some, tension and perhaps contradictions between the Old Testament on some parts and what we find in assyriology. Can you maybe give some examples?
No.
No, no
Sorry.
worries.
Neo-Assyrian period is a lot later than my preferred area of work. So I know
Sure.
they exist. It's something I've researched before, but I don't have examples off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Yeah, now your lecture is going to be before in the beginning, the creation myths that shaped Genesis. So, which creation myths and stories do you have in mind specifically?
So we'll be looking at the Enuma Elish, which is often known as the Babylonian creation myth.
Hmm.
A myth called Atrahasis, which is Mesopotamia's kind of forerunner to Noah and the flood. Um, and there are two more: Adapa and the South Wind, and obviously Gilgamesh.
Hmm. It seems like there's a lot of overlap between all of these. So, clearly people are borrowing from each other, right? Can you maybe map out for us who was borrowing from whom?
Sure. Um, so there are, yeah. As I said, the Mesopotamian literary tradition is very long. You're not going to get a lot of texts that are completely unrelated to what had gone before them because tradition in Mesopotamian scribal systems was very, very important.
Mhm.
They were very aware that they had this very long historical background, and it was a matter of pride and prestige for a lot of people. So you didn't necessarily want to go and create something completely new. What people did more often was to take what was already existing and use that and rework it creatively to express different themes, maybe, or new ideas, but using motifs that were already in existence. The easiest way to really look at that would be the Epic of Gilgamesh,
Mhm.
which is kind of a later composition, um, but it's a composition that was created using pre-existing stories. So we have a handful of stories about this king Gilgamesh written in Sumerian that date to a lot earlier. And what the scribe who kind of compiled them and reworked them to create the epic did was take sections that worked for his purposes, made them into a single narrative, and kind of put an introduction and a conclusion on each end of the story to kind of reframe everything. So they go from this series of mostly unconnected stories about the same hero to a single narrative about this particular hero's quest for immortality and kind of eventual realization that he's not going to get there. He is human, and that the best way to attain immortality is to have your name live on in history. And I think he was pretty successful in doing that because it's several thousand years later and we're still talking about him.
You're right, yeah. Now, what are some ways that you would say the author of Genesis maybe borrows from some of these other creation stories, and maybe what are some similarities and also dissimilarities?
So there are a few different ones, and some of the similarities that people see are probably down to being written in a similar cultural context with this very rich communal, almost literary tradition. They're not necessarily indications that the person writing that section of the Genesis was like sitting down with a copy of Gilgamesh and copying things out, or saying, oh yeah, this is in Gilgamesh, this would be really great in my narrative as well. But they're ideas that were very, that they were just common ideas at the time. There are other examples where scholars are very confident that actually this is a section that was deliberately included because of its original appearance in a different mythological narrative. So again, to stick with Gilgamesh and actually also the Atrahasis, the flood narrative, you have a section where three birds are sent out. The hero of the flood narrative is out on his ark. The world has been flooded by whichever deity is responsible, Yahweh or Enlil, and they send out this series of three birds in order to see if the floodwaters had started to recede and if it was safe for them to try and find land. And that is a specific enough point of commonality that scholars are pretty convinced that actually this is an indication that the writers of Genesis were using Atrahasis or the Gilgamesh epic in their own story, but they shift the emphasis. So in Atrahasis, the flood is sent not as punishment for humans' sinful nature, but because humanity is simply too loud, too noisy, and the gods can't sleep. So Enlil sends the flood, and at the end, all the gods kind of are very they're very sorry about it. They regret what happened, and they promise not to do it again because like they need humanity to provide them with offerings to sustain them. And the writers of Genesis kind of take this general idea and flip it. So you have Yahweh sending the flood, not because he is capricious and is irritated that he can't sleep, but actually because humanity deserves it. And then at the end, he again promises not to do it again, but he does that like out of the goodness of his heart, as an act of mercy, not because actually he needs humanity to look after him.
Yeah, it seems like there's a reference to God also repenting of having done this, which may be some overlap with some of these other creation stories as you were mentioning there. Yeah, so whenever there's some discontinuity or conflict or differences between these stories, specifically with the author of Genesis and the other creation myths, would you say that the author of Genesis is doing that, for some kind of theological critique of these other cultures?
I think it depends. In some instances, yes, I probably would say so. Again, using the example we just looked at, you don't, or at least Yahweh is not generally portrayed as being, as reacting to something in a way that is not like justifiable or reasonable. The Mesopotamian deities are very human in their emotional range, and sending the flood because you can't sleep is a little bit of an overreaction. So having Yahweh send a flood for a better reason, right? It's not just that he's irritable and needs a long nap. It's that actually humanity deserves it. So I think that could definitely be seen as a reaction against or a comment on the Mesopotamian deities.
Whenever you read some account about how these deities are, effectively pretty flippant and, they're doing this just because they're annoyed. Wouldn't the reader just say, okay, well, why are these deities worth believing in whenever they're so flippant? I mean, you would think that the author would maybe try to couch it a little bit better, right?
No, because actually it's the idea of gods as being like divine caretakers of humanity is kind of a new idea. The gods in Mesopotamia they're powerful and you worship them because they're powerful, not because they're going to look after you. You hope they're going to look after you. Absolutely. You pray to them and you ask them to send the rain when you need rain, to heal your uncle if he's sick. But there's no moral imperative for them to help you. They don't do it because
Mhm.
they are ultimately good. Um, they do it because they're powerful and because you're offering them something in return. So it seems weird to us because a lot of people raised in this kind of Western Christian mindset of God is good, God ultimately knows what is best and is going to do what is best for humanity. It's just it's not something that was present in these older religions.
Hmm. Now, whenever scholars talk about myth, what exactly do they mean? Are they using it in the very casual way that we often use it, or do they have a more nuanced definition?
I mean, I'm not a specialist in mythology, but the way that I use it and the way that I see other people tend to use it just refers to stories about the gods. And you can have different categories of myths. So you can have etiological myths that explain um, why something in the natural world is the way it is. Um, so an example of that actually is found in an incantation for toothache. It kind of explains that toothache exists because there's a worm burrowing into your tooth. Um, yeah, so you get kind of those kinds of myths, and then creation myths that explain how the world came into being and why it is the way it is, and then obviously myths about the relationships between the deities and um, how they interact with each other, and then how they interact with humanity as well.
So, would you are you going to be going over in this lecture the structure of the cosmos in these creation myths versus, or maybe in similarity to the structure of the cosmos in the book of Genesis? Does that factor in?
Yeah, I'll be touching on it briefly. It's it's not going to be a large portion of the presentation because it's something that's relatively brief in both accounts, and because there aren't a lot of points of contact there. There are a couple, but it's for me, there's not enough to make it worth really spending a lot of time on.
Yeah, but it seems like they had a concept of the cosmos that is very different than how we understand it now today, right? They seem to conceive of a dome structure with water above the dome. Is that something that you find in these creation myths?
It depends on which creation myth you're looking at. There's definitely an idea that before the physical world was created, there's a lot of water. You see that in the myth Enuma Elish, where essentially the personified freshwater Apsu and personified seawater Tiamat kind of mingle their waters together and create the other gods. And then that myth kind of progresses in this almost pre-physical realm until the Babylonian city god Marduk finally defeats Tiamat, who is both personified seawater but also some kind of very fearsome monster. And then from her body, he creates the physical world. Um, yeah, it kind of, there are different understandings of the world depending on which particular myth you're reading.
Yeah, you mentioned one deity there, Apsu, and something that I've noticed a lot, not just in the book of Genesis, but other canonical texts. It seems like there is an emphasis on this concept of the abyss. Is that coming out of these ancient Mesopotamian cultures? Because there is a
Um,
lot of discussion about the abyss.
not that I know of. You do get an emphasis, like I said, on water.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of that is to do with the importance of water for the ancient world, especially in areas of Mesopotamia where you don't get enough rainfall for rainfall agriculture. You have to have irrigation. So people were very, very aware of and reliant on like the rivers doing what they were supposed to do, and the canals being properly maintained so that they could grow their food and that kind of thing. Um, I wouldn't say that an abyss was necessarily terribly important. You do see in later mythologies the Apsu is understood as this subterranean water
Hmm.
underneath the earth, which is also the realm of the god Enlil, and kind of where he has his home. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah. So One thing that I've noticed, of course, in the book of Genesis is this concept of, humans bearing the image of God. Is there anything like that in these other creation stories?
I mean, not in those many words, but human creation is very, very similar. The gods create humanity out of clay,
Mm.
and then instead of having the breath of life from Yahweh breathed into them, there's usually some like physical part of a deity mixed in with that clay when it's being formed. So in Enuma Elish, no, in Atrahasis, there is a god who is killed almost like a sacrifice, and then his blood is incorporated into the clay, which gives the human entities, I guess, that spark of divine life. And humans are understood to be in the same form as gods, but it's not. I don't think it's ever explicitly framed in the same way as in Genesis.
Yeah, it seems to be a pretty relatively unique claim, just insofar as I could tell. Would you say that there's some big discovery in assyriology that helped maybe reshape your interpretation of the book of Genesis or give new insights into it?
Um, Not my own interpretation, because this material has been around for so long that
Mm.
it's kind of scholarly consensus, and has been since before I started my own studies. Um, I think in terms of the history of the field, certainly Enuma Elish was translated in the Victorian times, and its very first translations, it was kind of understood and referred to as the Chaldean Genesis, the Chaldean account of the creation. And people got very, very excited because of the similarities to the book of Genesis. I think that was kind of one of the first points where people started to realize that actually the Hebrew Bible is not something that stands on its own in the literary tradition of the ancient Near East. It does relate to the literature that was around before it as well.
Hmm. What's the main takeaway that you want the audience to really come away with from your lecture that you're going to be delivering?
I think that there is an incredibly rich and varied literary tradition in the ancient Near East that the Hebrew Bible is a part of and is in conversation with, and that just because there are similarities between Genesis and some of the other mythological accounts does not mean that Genesis was kind of blindly cobbled together by people who are plagiarizing existing literary tropes, because I think it's actually much more interesting than that. And understanding how all of these things fit together is much more fascinating than just saying, oh, they stole it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what did people look at that kind of negatively though? Borrowing from other texts, is that something that they really had a problem with?
No, it was accepted practice and expected to a certain degree. There wasn't the same understanding of authorship in Mesopotamia as we have today. You didn't have people like, you wouldn't necessarily have author as your job
Hmm.
title, right? You might be able to read and write, and you might spend some time composing, but it was done in conversation with the textual tradition that existed in your community. And there wasn't this kind of understanding of the creative act as a personal endeavor. It was primarily something inspired by the gods. You give thanks to the goddess Nisaba or Nabu for your ability to write and for the inspiration that comes when you are writing. So having this kind of knee-jerk reaction to textual borrowing, textual transmission, as being, oh my God, it's plagiarism, would have been completely anathema. It was very, very common to share sections and to rework parts of pre-existing literature into something new.
Did the authors of these other accounts and stories actually identify themselves, or are they just anonymous?
Occasionally, we know that the person who put together the Gilgamesh epic was called Sinlaki Unini. We have a couple of other names of people who wrote hymns, priestess Enhe Joanna is attributed to, well, her authorship is attributed to her for several hymns and other texts. But it's not as common as it is today. There are a lot of things that we don't have names associated with.
Wow. Well, that's all that I have for today. I know we're out of time. I'm really looking forward to your lecture. I'm going to put a link to it, and so everybody go and check it out. But I also want to ask you, where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Sure. My website is digitalhammurabi.com. I'm on YouTube at youtube.com/digitalhammurabi. And I think my Instagram is the same as well. But there are links to my Instagram on the website.
Really looking forward to it. Thank you so much for coming on. It was an honor.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/reason in theology.